Olene's 1938 Jamestown Memories. A day started early back in 1938 for 10-year-old Olene Mabe. As she awakened, she could smell the freshly baked biscuits and fried ham her mother, Ada, had prepared for breakfast. There would be her mother's newly churned butter on the table, along with jellies and jams made from the fruit of the family's orchard, and lots of creamy milk from their cow. Her parents had been up since 5 a.m. Olene's father, Will, had already brought in wood, lit the morning fire in the cook stove, gone across the street to the well at his parents' house to get water for the family's use that day, and took care of the livestock, eaten breakfast, and left for his job at Oakdale Cotton Mill. After breakfast, Olene gathered up her school things and the bag lunch her mother had prepared for her. With her older siblings, she started the 1.5-mile walk to Jamestown School. Since there weren't enough buses in those days, the children that lived within 3 miles of the school had to walk or find another way to school. Olene was glad that this was not a rainy day. Bell's Chapel Road, where she lived, could get awfully muddy when it rained. Once there was sleet and rain, and the children slipped and slid so much they had to give up and return home. The morning sun shone brightly on Olene's curly red hair. She had just washed it with the rainwater she had collected and rinsed it with vinegar. As the children walked to school and turned onto Dillon Road, others from the Wards, the Edwards, the Johnstons, and the Dillon families joined them. The sound of the children's laughter rang in the air. They would pass only a few houses. The woods grew thick where Riverwalk is now. The bridge was narrow across the river, and the kids couldn't help but peer over to look at the moving water below. They were always careful to look and listen at the railroad tracks because there was no crossing signal at that time. In later years, when they did ride the school bus, a child had to get out and look up and down the track before the bus could cross. Back then, the trains were harder to see because the trees were allowed to grow nearer to the tracks. School always began with the students meeting in the auditorium for assembly, which included the Pledge of Allegiance, a devotional, and the singing of a few songs. Olene was usually called on to read the scripture verse for the day. She was in the 4th grade this year and thought her teacher was especially nice. Classes began, but everything in the school had come to a stop because a train was passing through town. The school windows were partially open even in cold weather because of the radiator steam heat. Nothing could be heard over the loud screams of the whistle and the roar and clatter of the massive steam trains. Through the large windows, you could see the billowing plumes of smoke the engines produced. It was soon lunchtime, and one of the kids from the Methodist Protestant orphanage at 5 Points asked Olene if she would trade her homemade lunch for a lunch ticket for the cafeteria. Olene agreed, but that afternoon Olene's stomach didn't feel quite right. Her teacher sent her back to the school cafeteria, and a lady there gave her some vinegar and water. After classes in math, reading, and history, it wasn't long before the school day was over and time for the children to walk back home. On the way home, Olene grew quiet. She was thinking that she was glad tomorrow was Saturday, which meant she and her brother Julian would be sitting at the Broadhurst Movie Theater in High Point. For only 10 cents, they could watch their cowboy favorites and an exciting serial cliffhanger. She had to wonder if her heroine survived last week's disaster. Young people walked everywhere in those days. Olene and her friends thought nothing of the 2-mile walk from home to City Lake Park. Her family usually went there every weekend. There's always something going on there. Celebrations, concerts, picnics, dances, swimming. In those days, the pavilion there served as a community center. When they arrived home from school after a few chores, the neighborhood kids would gather and play games in the middle of Bell's Chapel Road, since a passing car was a seldom event. Sometimes Mr. White would pass by in his mule-drawn wagon, coming home from High Point where he had been selling produce from his garden. The kids would ride their bikes or play games like stealing the sticks. Sometimes they would work in the garden or in the orchard. Most of families that Olene knew had a vegetable garden and kept livestock for their meat, milk, and eggs. That night at supper, Olene looked around at the faces that she loved. She wished that things could stay like this forever, that they could always stay together as a family. She purposely fixed in her mind how each person looked and where they sat around the table. She would hold on to this memory for the rest of her life. After supper, Olene's house grew quiet as the kerosene lamps were lit and her older siblings studied their lessons. Olene wished they could go visiting the neighbors like they had last night. How dark the night was, even with the kerosene lantern her father carried. When the children finished their homework, they gathered in the living room around the battery-operated radio.
Well, here's an interesting article on crop surpluses, Molly.
They listened to programs like Fibber McGee and Molly and Amos and Andy. Or sometimes they played records on the crank-up Victrola. After work, her father had walked to Johnson's store in Jamestown and bought a few things for the family. As always, he had brought Olene a small bag of candy. Olene shared her candy with everyone as they listened to the radio that night. 9 o'clock came and Olene's mother said, "Bedtime, children." Olene went to the room she shared with her sisters and soon was dreaming sweet, youthful dreams. She did not dream that in a few short years the world would turn upside down and the young men of Jamestown would leave to fight a war an ocean away. She did not dream that her brother Julian, so good, so gifted, would give his life for his country somewhere in France. Her dreams were probably more along the line of the night years in her future when she would look across a crowded dance floor and fall in love with a handsome young fiddler named Olene Mabe, who she would later marry. Or perhaps she would dream of the children like the ones she would have, Carol and Richard. Olene's home place on Bell's Chapel Road was located where Bell's Wesleyan Church now stands. Olene McGee Mabe, now 92 years old, still resides in the Jamestown area.